I grew up with Dylan. I lost my leg trying to save him. Yet, he believed the accident was a plan I orchestrated to separate him from his true love. Because of that, he hated me for the rest of his life. Before he died, he only said one thing: if he could do it all over again, he'd rather be disabled than ever see me again. When I opened my eyes, I was back to the moment right before his accident. This time, I let him be. In this life, I didn't save him. The smell of disinfectant filled my nostrils, while Dylan's parents were outside the operating room, crying uncontrollably. But I couldn't hear their sobs clearly, my eardrums felt like they were about to burst. Finally, my mom shook my arm urgently. "Chloe, go comfort Dylan's parents." I snapped back to reality and shook my head. Just then, the doctor came out, looking regretful as he informed Dylan's parents to prepare themselves. The car ran over his ankle, causing a comminuted fracture. He's alive, but his foot will be permanently damaged. Which meant Dylan would be crippled. Dylan's mother fainted right then and there, and I just stood there, staring at my own legs, still intact. They were the same length, and I could still wear normal-sized shoes. I had been reborn. In my previous life, Dylan had found a girl on the road in the early hours of the morning. It was late, and for that girl, Dylan must have seemed like a savior. Without saying much, Dylan took her back to his house, and their love quickly sparked. She admired him, and he pitied her. But Dylan's parents didn't approve of their relationship. They didn't like the girl and strongly urged Dylan to send her back to her own home. Later, at the dinner table, Dylan's parents started to criticize her. Which girl would wander the streets alone at 3 in the morning? Dylan frowned. "I already told you, she had a fight with her parents. And just because of a fight, she thinks it's fine to stay at a stranger's house? Dylan, you're not thinking this through. Think about Chloe. If you asked her parents, would they let her stay with someone she just met?" I buried my head in my food, but somehow felt the sting of those words. Before they could finish, Dylan threw his bowl down and stormed out. In the past life, I was afraid he would do something rash, so I followed him. I didn't catch what Dylan shouted at me, but I saw an out-of-control truck speeding toward us. Almost instinctively, I pushed Dylan out of the way, but I was hit on the ankle. From that moment on, I limped. My right foot swelled up, and I could only wear specially made men's shoes. Dylan blamed himself and, days later, proposed to marry me. I asked, "What about her?" Dylan shrugged carelessly. "My parents don't approve of her, it's over anyway. Why should I keep holding on?" He spoke so nonchalantly, but after marriage, he despised me. Later, he would cry and beg me to drink with him. But alcohol caused sores on my feet, which led to infection, and eventually, I had to have my leg amputated. And at that time, I overheard Dylan complaining to his parents. "A paralyzed person, what's the difference between that and being dead? Why doesn't Chloe just die?" Everything I did for Dylan was out of a small act of kindness. But he wanted me dead. In the dead of night, I lit the gas in the house. In the blaze, Dylan abandoned me in the fire, looking for an escape. But it was useless, no one could get out. Before I died, Dylan yelled at me, "If I could do it again, I'd rather be disabled than ever see you again." I was reborn. This time, when Dylan ran out, I didn't chase after him. In my past life, he would often say jokingly, "If you hadn't come out, I wouldn't have looked back on the road. Maybe neither of us would have been hurt." But this time, things happened just as they were supposed to. As I reflected, a loud yell suddenly came from the hospital room. Dylan woke up, unable to accept that he was now disabled. "Don't move. The doctor said you have a comminuted fracture. It's already a miracle you've recovered this much." I turned to see Dylan, determined, getting out of bed and trying to walk on his right foot. But after just one step, he screamed in pain and collapsed on the floor. Muttering, "This can't be. It's just a simple fracture. I won't be lame." Dylan's mother turned away, covering her mouth, crying silently. I felt a deep sorrow. Dylan's mom had always been good to me, even taking care of me meticulously in my past life. Now, I could only feel sorry for her. How could she have such a hopeless son? I helplessly walked over and called the nurse to help Dylan back into bed. But Dylan pushed me away. "Go away. My foot is fine, I can walk on my own." The nurse tried to help him, but I stopped her. Now the roles were reversed. I looked down at him from above as he flailed on the floor. In my past life, after we got married, Dylan thought I staged the accident to break him up with that girl, and he hated me for it. One time, I had to get out of bed to use the bathroom. I tried to move to the wheelchair, but accidentally tipped it over, falling to the floor. I struggled for a while, unable to get up. Finally, I looked up and saw Dylan, hiding behind the door, watching me with an expression of glee. In that moment, my heart turned to ice. Then, a voice broke my reverie. "Dylan, stop messing around. Can't you just focus on recovering? Please, I'm begging you." Looking at how Dylan's mom was trembling, I sighed. "If you keep doing this, your foot will only get worse. It will swell to the point where you won't even fit into your shoes." The nurse looked at me as if asking, "How do you know that?" I knew, of course. I had lived through all of it. How could I forget? This time, I didn't want to have anything to do with Dylan. But my mom couldn't let go of the friendship our families had, so she insisted I take Dylan home after his discharge. When they removed the cast, I smelled a foul odor. He hadn't bathed for days, and the sweat combined with the smell of the plaster was overwhelming. I couldn't help but wrinkle my nose and take a step back. Dylan, though, quietly gripped the bedsheet. Such a proud person, what would he do now? On the way home, I asked again. Dylan's injury was caused by that girl. Has she come to see him? Dylan's parents scowled at the mention of her name. Through the rearview mirror, I saw Dylan's lips pressed into a thin line. Having grown up together, I knew exactly what that meant. Stubborn. Holding on, just pretending nothing was wrong. Giselle said she's too busy, but she'll come by in a few days to take care of me. Dylan's mom opened her mouth to say something, but Dylan's dad stopped her with a wave of his hand. After settling Dylan in, I turned to his mom and said, "Let him do whatever he wants. He's been through a lot, and his mood needs to improve for his recovery." She looked at me, hesitated, but finally said nothing. I understood her unspoken words. Dylan and I had grown up together, and our parents had silently agreed that we'd end up together. As for my feelings for Dylan, I tilted my head, trying to remember when that innocent affection first appeared. I couldn't recall exactly. I only knew that when Dylan brought someone home, I secretly cried. As for when my love faded, maybe it was when Dylan misunderstood that I wanted to hurt her and yelled at me? Or when he forgot my birthday while taking her home? Anyway, by the time we got married, I didn't have any love left. But at that time, I had no other choice. This time, I won't be involved in anything related to Dylan. I hope he and her last forever. I just don't know if that girl, Giselle, can handle what's to come. Both my family and Dylan's live in detached houses. Although we are neighbors, we rarely bump into each other unless I intentionally walk over, and sometimes several days go by without us crossing paths. The next time I saw Dylan was a week later. Dylan was out for a walk, pushed by the girl he liked, when he ran into me and my mom, who were just returning from the supermarket. "Let me introduce you properly, this is my fiancée, Giselle." In front of the person he loved, Dylan was completely free of any sharpness. The mottled shadows of the leaves were cast on his face, and the smile in his eyes was hard to ignore. My mom and I congratulated them with smiles, but Giselle immediately pulled her hand out of Dylan's. "Don't say that," Giselle said, shyly turning her body, "my mom doesn't even know you yet." After many years, Dylan's face finally showed the same proud expression it had when he was young. "If you want, we can get married right away." I couldn't bring myself to shatter the sweet illusion Dylan had built for himself. After we got home, my mom was still talking about it. Such a pitiful child. He's going to. I shook my head. He's getting the woman he loves, why feel sorry for him? You should still get a gift ready, you'll need it for the wedding, my mom said casually, but her eyes were still fixed on the neighbor's house. She sighed. That's not certain. Following her gaze, I saw Dylan's mother sitting on the swing in their yard, lost in thought. It seemed like overnight, her hair had turned streaked with white. In my previous life, Dylan used to complain that if it weren't for my reckless behavior, he and Giselle would have already been married and having kids. I retorted, "I never wanted to marry you. Wasn't it you who said I was hurt because of you? That you'd be responsible for me?" He stared at my legs, his eyes filled with an unreadable darkness. "Chloe, stop pretending. I know you like me, you've always wanted to marry me. This is all just a scheme to make me marry you. You and my mom planned this together, trying to morally pressure me into submission. I fell silent. I, Chloe, thought I was doing okay in life. Why would I purposely handicap myself for a man who couldn't even see clearly? When Dylan's mother looked over at us, she quickly wiped away the tears in her eyes. I pursed my lips and sighed deeply. Dylan still seemed to think that he and Giselle's meeting was arranged by fate. Little did he know, in my previous life, I had someone investigate. Giselle was just after a wealthy man. Dylan's path home was one that Giselle walked back and forth along more than 10 times. Dylan's mother came to deliver the engagement invitation. She looked at me with regret in her eyes. Chloe. I smiled and handed the invitation to my mom, then said, I've partnered with a friend to open a guest house. We're launching the day after tomorrow, so I'm heading out tomorrow. In my past life, after I ended up in a wheelchair and Dylan turned his back on me, only my college roommate would come to take care of me occasionally. I didn't know how she found out about me, but several times when I fell from the wheelchair, she would struggle to pick me up. However, she was in a tough spot herself, married to a gambler who lost everything. This time, before she could marry that gambler, I decided to take her to another city to make money, just to repay her kindness in the past life. Dylan's mother seemed taken aback, saying I left so suddenly. That evening, someone knocked on my door. I opened it to find Dylan standing there. He was leaning on a crutch, his right foot so swollen that he could only fit into a pair of large slippers. Is there something you need? Given everything from the past life, I couldn't be too kind in my tone. The weather's cold outside, you should head back home if there's nothing urgent. I tried to shut the door, but Dylan suddenly blocked my move with his hand. After a brief pause, he pulled out a small gift. I heard you're opening a guest house and can't make it to my engagement party? I nodded and hesitated for a moment before saying, Congratulations on your engagement. I didn't mean what I said last time. I was just angry with my mom. Don't take it to heart. What had he said? Oh, now I remembered. Dylan's mother had disagreed with Giselle marrying him, she thought that I should be with him instead. Dylan had let his frustration out on me, shouting, Impossible. I have no feelings for Chloe, get that out of your head. I wasn't sure if he was talking to me or to his mother. But now, it didn't matter. I shook my head. It's okay. The next day, I met up with my friend and flew out. Fortunately, the guest house was doing well. We had many visitors. There, we heard all kinds of stories from people. One night, while we were on the night shift and drinking and singing with the guests, Jessie suddenly said to me, Chloe, you seem a little different. I blinked. How so? You're so capable now, you don't need anyone's help. I remember when you were in college, you were always asking me to do everything for you, even passing you water when you were on your bed. Her exaggerated tone made me laugh out loud. In my past life, after I was crippled, I needed help with everything. This time, since I was fine, I made sure to return the favor. The next time I saw Dylan was a year later. I returned home just in time to see the neighbors moving out. I happened to run into Dylan's father, but when he recognized me, he turned and walked away. Mom, where are they moving to? I asked carefully. It was hard to ignore the subtle shift in the atmosphere between our families this time. Had something happened while I wasn't around? But my mom frowned, and before she could say anything, she waved her hand dismissively. From my bedroom window, I could see next door. Dylan was hobbling around with his crutch, his right foot stretched straight out, unable to touch the ground. Dylan's father, however, suddenly lost his temper. He threw a box into the car and kicked Dylan in the butt. But this time, I overheard some words that seemed out of place. Where was Giselle? Finally, after I badgered her, my mom finally told me. Didn't they get engaged before? His father saw how devoted Dylan was to that woman, and though he didn't want to, there was nothing he could do. And look at Dylan now, how could he find another girlfriend? My mom was always so empathetic. Get to the point. Cutting off her emotional rambling, I learned that Giselle had scammed Dylan out of 1.88 million yuan for the wedding. Our families were comfortable, but not wealthy enough for such extravagance. But now, Dylan's parents just wanted them to get married and live happily, with the wedding money already transferred to Giselle's account. But 3 months later, Giselle suddenly claimed she was pregnant, only to later lose the baby, causing a huge scene with Dylan's parents. In short, she wanted to break off the engagement. Giselle said, "This cripple couldn't even protect our child. What's the point of marrying him? I have to break up with him." Dylan was so stunned. With his son in such a state, Dylan's mother obviously didn't want to call off the engagement. In the end, they had no choice but to say the engagement could be called off, but they needed to get back the 1.88 million yuan for the wedding preparations. Giselle's family, however, insisted that the 1.88 million was compensation for losing the child. They refused to return a single cent. In the end, Dylan's parents lost both their money and their dignity. The two elderly people had lived here for most of their lives. Now, they couldn't even stay here because of the shame. I wanted to go over and say hello, but my mom stopped me. But what I didn't expect was for Dylan to actually message me first, asking to meet in the park. Dylan showed up late and stumbled a little on the cobblestone path. When he saw that I wasn't going to help him, just sitting there, he seemed a bit awkward. "Do you think I'm stupid?" Now I'd become the joke of the whole community. I paused, then decided to tell him the truth. Yes. It had been a year since we last saw each other, and Dylan had lost a lot of weight. His clothes didn't seem as fancy as before either. He had become sloppy. Dylan chuckled to himself and moved his heavy right foot a little. "Look at my foot. I really want to chop it off." At this rate, if he kept neglecting himself, cutting it off wouldn't be too far off. 1.88 million. It wouldn't bankrupt Dylan's parents, but it would still cause them significant losses. After a moment of silence, Dylan suddenly looked at me seriously. "Chloe, if I told you that the baby Giselle is carrying isn't mine, would you believe me?" "What?" Seeing my shocked expression, Dylan gave a bitter laugh and pointed at his foot. "Look at me now. My foot is swollen so much it hurts just to touch it. What could I even do?" "So Giselle. She's lying. It's just a rumor." Dylan stuffed his hands in his pockets and stared at the sky. The more he pretended to be indifferent, the more I could see the pain in his face. "She hooked up with some rich second-generation guy and just wanted to get rid of me quickly." That was something I had expected. But Giselle, that was just cruel. She cheated and then turned the blame on me, even taking the bride price money without a conscience. Dylan asked me, "You always act like you're on guard when you hear Giselle's name, so why didn't you stop me when I ran off?" I opened my mouth but couldn't find anything to say. See? No matter what, men always find a way to shift the blame onto you. Not wanting to stay alone with him any longer, I stood up, keeping my distance. "I'm leaving. Don't let your parents wait too long. You should go back too." Just as I was about to leave, Dylan suddenly grabbed my wrist. "If you had stopped me back then, do you think things would have turned out differently?" I pulled my hand away from his and spoke distantly. "No. My point is, I wouldn't have stopped you." This time, I came home planning to give myself a break and give Jessie enough time to sort out her own matters. Yes, fate is that mysterious. In the end, they somehow ended up together again. I didn't try to talk them out of it. In a way, Jessie and Dylan were alike, stubborn until they hit a wall. All I could do was give Jessie some support. Over the past 3 years of running the guest house, Jessie and I split the earnings 50-50. My pocket grew fuller, but Jessie ended up with nothing. Her boyfriend had taken it all. But I'm relieved. She finally saw her boyfriend for who he really was, before they got married. A year away from home, and when I return, I get treated like a princess. But just a week later, my mom barged into the house and slammed the door. I jumped out of bed and pulled out a stack of money from my bag. "Is this enough?" I tried to mimic the gesture I'd seen on my phone, using the money to shut her up. But when I looked closely, I realized my mom's eyes were red. "What's going on?" I stopped pretending and asked. "Did you fight with Dad again?" My mom had been neighbors with Dylan's parents for over 10 years. This was the first time she pointed at their building and cursed them out. "Your dad said Dylan's parents' company had some problems, so I went to ask if they needed help." But guess what his mother said? I listened quietly as my mom's eyes welled up with tears. "She told me to go home and ask you if you want to marry Dylan." I was stunned. Indeed, it was shameless. She kept saying that Dylan didn't understand things, but she could tell you had feelings for him. But when Dylan did that thing before, why didn't they discipline their son properly? I stood there, silent. I hadn't expected Dylan's parents to be so blatant about trying to find someone to take over. We raised a good daughter. Why would we let her be a nanny for their son? It's not like no one wants you. As she spoke, my mom started glancing at me, almost as if she were hinting at something. Seeing me stay quiet, her voice lowered. Chloe, but I have to say, you two grew up in front of us, and if. I shoved the money into her hands. No if. It's hard enough to live again. Marrying Dylan again would feel worse than dying. In my past life, my relationship with Dylan completely broke down after one drunken night. I thought Dylan had really given up on Giselle. 6 months after we got married, Dylan and I accidentally had dinner and drinks together. After a few drinks, I hugged my knees and started crying. In my 20s, the best years of my life, and I became a cripple. Dylan, who had always been distant, suddenly changed his attitude, gently holding my face and wiping away my tears. Don't cry. You have me now. I looked at him through tear-filled eyes, and the gentle man in front of me didn't feel real. But under his sweet words, the last wall in my heart was finally broken down. I couldn't help but hug his neck and cry my heart out. Dylan, I'll never be able to wear high heels again. Dylan gently patted my back. It's okay. I know you got hurt trying to save me. If it weren't for you, how could I be sitting here talking to you now? I pulled myself out of his embrace and asked, is that true? Having known Dylan for 20 years, I knew what he looked like when he was happy. After we got married, he wasn't happy, and I could tell. But Dylan wiped away all my tears and swore it was true. Then what about you? Chloe, do you like me? Or, have you always wanted to marry me? The feelings I had never expressed when we were young resurfaced. My heart raced, thumping in my ears. Under his intense gaze, I said, I do. But right after that, I watched the heat in Dylan's eyes fade, replaced by mockery. He jumped up and pulled away from me, pointing at my nose, calling me shameless. Just because you want to marry me, you deliberately set up this whole thing to force me to marry you? Now I can never marry the woman I love. Are you happy? Chloe, I feel disgusted by the 20 years we spent together. The drunkenness suddenly left me, and I couldn't react fast enough to what had just happened. This change came so suddenly, I was caught completely off guard. But my confusion only made Dylan laugh. Stop pretending. If I didn't do this, you'd never tell the truth. Chloe, how long are you going to play the victim? Then, with a slam, Dylan stormed out. That night, I felt like he had crushed me under his foot. Later, I found out. That day was Giselle's engagement day. She married a rich older man and his 3-year younger stepson. After Dylan's mom tried to matchmake us, I began to deliberately distance myself from him. In this life, I had achieved a small measure of success, and I avoided anything that wasn't good. After Jessie broke up with her boyfriend, we returned to the guest house the next day. Life was peaceful for a month, until Jessie's ex came looking for her. That day, he drove away 2/3 of our customers. Jessie exploded and called the police, but the scoundrel told the officers, "Sir, this is a personal dispute. My ex owes me money, and I'm here to collect. Once I get it, I'll leave." The first time, they chased him off. The second time, they did the same. But after several times, the police had no choice. These kinds of legal-savvy scoundrels are the hardest to deal with. He hasn't hurt you, so we can't arrest him. Jessie cried in anger. He took over 100,000 from me, and now he's turning around and biting back? I'll tell you, you're dreaming. The scoundrel snorted coldly and dragged a chair over to sit by the door. He looked like he wasn't going to leave unless he got paid. For 3 consecutive days, business was very slow. Just as Jessie was about to give in and pay, Dylan suddenly hit the scoundrel on the head with his cane. Jessie and I gasped, fearing a fight might break out right at the guesthouse door. But the scoundrel probably saw that Dylan was disabled, and the fist he had raised was lowered. Wow, isn't that Dylan? Dylan was already well known in our area, so it was normal for the scoundrel to recognize him. Got deceived by your fiancé, huh? Now you're here playing the hero? Why don't you dig some money out of your fingers for me? $880,000 would do, ha ha ha. Dylan's face turned red with anger as he told him to leave. He then issued a warning, if you come here causing trouble again, I'll hit you every time I see you. But the scoundrel just sneered and looked Dylan up and down, his tone dripping with disdain. Dylan, you really think you're some rich second-generation heir? Everyone knows your family's situation now. What a shameless fool. Dylan clenched his fists and stayed silent, on the edge of losing control. In the end, it was Jesse, using the power of my family, who managed to get the scoundrel to leave. I made Dylan some hot tea. He sat in the guest house, looking around, his eyes full of envy. Finally, I broke the silence first. Did you tell your parents you're here? Dylan didn't answer, burying his face. You didn't come here just to see my guest house, did you? Seeing the man acting like a mute, I started losing patience, and it wasn't until I told him to leave that he spoke up. He said, Chloe, my family went bankrupt. Even though I had prepared myself mentally, hearing Dylan say it in person still shocked me. As far as I knew, Dylan's parents owned several stores in high-traffic locations. With those stores alone, they could have lived comfortably for life. After a few more questions, Dylan, a grown man, started crying uncontrollably in the guest house. I helplessly rubbed my forehead. Why does it seem like everyone has some issue with my guest house lately? After calming him down, I placed a tissue box next to Dylan. If you're planning to keep crying, I'm leaving. When I looked up again, Dylan's nose was red. At that moment, it felt like I was looking at my past self through him. But the Dylan from my past wasn't as patient as me. Every time I cried, he would just leave with a slammed door. Chloe, I regret it. I want you back. I pursed my lips helplessly. Though it wasn't the right time to crush his hope, I still said, I've never been by your side, how could I come back? Now, tell me about the bankruptcy. After a long pause, Dylan finally managed to explain everything. Dylan had hoped to marry me based on our past bond. But after spending $1.88 million, most of the money was gone. Just when he was thinking of making money, Dylan heard about an investment opportunity. Supposedly, it was a guaranteed win. At first, Dylan was cautious. But after he invested $200,000, the other party kept sending things to his house, luxury items, jewelry, everything. This dazzled Dylan, and not only did he pour all his savings into it, but he also took out a loan for over $10 million. A month later, Dylan realized something was wrong. By the time he figured it out, the scammer had disappeared. All the money was completely drained. To repay the loan, the banks took away the family stores. Now, the three of them had no source of income. I know I was wrong. I shouldn't have ignored my mom's advice. If I had married you, our family wouldn't have ended up like this. I frowned in disgust. That was just your own stupidity. It has nothing to do with who you marry. No. Dylan shook his head, tears splashing onto my arm. I wiped it off in distaste, but then he said, my dad found out from his contacts that the scammer was one of Giselle's husband's subordinates. They did this to get back at me. I gasped, my mouth falling open. I didn't expect Giselle to be involved in this. Dylan's parents went bankrupt, and his mother ended up in the hospital. My mom, still constrained by the past relationship between the two families, went to visit the hospital. Not only that, but she also insisted on bringing me back home. When you were little, Dylan's mom took care of you a lot. She had a stroke from this stress. You should go see her. A stroke. It was worse than I had imagined. Dylan's mom was now bedridden and unable to move. Her mouth was twisted to the side, saliva dripping down. When she saw me, tears immediately welled up in her eyes. Ah. I didn't understand what Dylan's mom was saying, but I went over and held her hand tightly. Don't worry, I'll try my best to get the money back for you. Don't be afraid. We both wiped away our tears, but I felt just as heartbroken. One bad choice from Dylan, and his whole family was suffering. In my past life, after marrying Dylan, his parents treated me kindly. My mom paid some of Dylan's mother's medical bills and hired a nurse to take care of her. At home, she was still crying. How did her life end up like this? She used to feed all the stray cats in the neighborhood. How did she end up like this when she's old? It's all Dylan's fault for being useless. Chloe, do you think we can get the money back? It could be done, but it would be hard. The whole thing was part of Giselle's plot to target Dylan. The stolen money might even be in her hands. Chloe, we can't care about that jerk Dylan, but his mom's nursing fees are going to be a huge burden. I lowered my head, already considering investigating Giselle. Giselle's husband is a wealthy and influential man in our area, so I didn't dare to confront him directly. But I did uncover a secret between Giselle and her stepson. When we met at a cafe, Giselle sneered when she saw me. I was wondering who it was. A few years ago, you were defeated by me, and now you still dare to show up in front of me? I smiled and said nothing, just gesturing for her to sit down and talk. Maybe Giselle just wanted to see what tricks I had up my sleeve. But when she saw the pictures on my phone, she immediately sat up straight. What's this about? I slammed my phone down on the table. Nothing, I just want to learn from you. How do you manage to get along so well with your stepson? Giselle grabbed my phone to delete the pictures, but the ones I showed her were my wallpaper, and she didn't even know the password. How shameless are you? It's been so long, and you're still trying to remind me of the past? You can't stand seeing me do well, can you? I raised an eyebrow. I really didn't want to see her doing well. After all, my tragic experience in the past life was partly due to her. In my past life, I caught them being flirtatious behind my back more than once after we were married. But Giselle's life now wasn't exactly great. Her husband had yellow teeth and was a perverted old man. Everyone in their circle knew he had a special kink for torturing people. Her stepson wasn't normal either, and the photos I saw were enough to make my eyes burn. So I got straight to the point. Dylan's parents' money was stolen by your subordinate. You need to get it back. Giselle laughed, her laughter wild, and she wiped the tears from her eyes in exaggerated amusement. So you're still trying to save that fool? Chloe, really? You still like him after all this time? Ha ha ha, you've never seen a good man, have you? I frowned. I could tolerate being insulted, but I couldn't stand her saying I was still in love with Dylan. I crossed my arms and looked at her, asking sincerely, is there nothing in your head but men for your entire life? Giselle didn't feel ashamed, in fact, she seemed proud of it. You were born rich, of course, you can afford to act all high and mighty. What's wrong with climbing up using men? What I can't stand is people like you, rich folks, who smell like money and still accuse us of selling our dignity for it. You're rich, so what? In the end, you lost to me. I smiled, watching her with an amused, calm expression. Since you've won, why are you now going to such lengths to destroy their family by any means necessary? In the end, it's just your wounded pride at work. Giselle's expression stiffened for a moment, then she gritted her teeth and warned me. I can ruin Dylan, and I can ruin your family. I tapped my phone screen slowly. The wallpaper reappeared in Giselle's view, and I shot back with a smile. Transfer the money to my bank account before 6 p.m. tomorrow. If the money doesn't come, I'll start showing my wallpaper to others. With that, I stood up and left. As I passed by Giselle, I whispered. Wasn't Dylan the man you fought so hard to get? Why treat your former benefactor like this, turning him into your scandal? I had barely taken a few steps when I heard the sound of a cup shattering behind me. I smirked. She had married into a wealthy family, yet she couldn't keep her composure. The next day, I received the money. After some thought, I transferred it to my mom. Should we give it to Dylan's dad? I shook my head. His mother was in the hospital, but could his father take care of her consistently? I firmly believed that if his father had been a decent man, Dylan wouldn't have turned out to be such a screw-up. My mom thought for a moment and then decided to use the money to buy back their store. The profits would go toward Dylan's mom's medical bills. Later, I visited his mother once, then returned to the guest house. I didn't know where Dylan had gone, but he never came to bother me again. A few months later, Jessie cautiously said that when she went home to visit her parents, she ran into Dylan. He's working in a restaurant now to make a living. As soon as news spread that Dylan was working there, my good-for-nothing ex showed up just to watch the drama. Apparently, Dylan got fired after a few days because the small business couldn't handle a bunch of punks causing trouble every day. I nodded, my heart undisturbed. Compared to the last life when he pushed me to the point of suicide, this was nothing. His mother had a stroke because of him, and I was the one who still had to pay her hospital bills. No matter what, I had been more than generous to Dylan's parents. But when I looked at Jessie, I asked her, "Do you think I'm too heartless, too cold?" Jessie frowned, paused for a moment, and then shook her head. Everything that happened to Dylan's parents was his own doing. He's an idiot, what's it got to do with you? I nodded, turned around, and continued brewing tea. But Jessie kept chattering behind me, "You can't think like that. Going soft on a scumbag always leads to a miserable ending." Yes. But thankfully, this time we stayed far away from scumbags and got a fresh start. End of the story.